If you have a Bible with you, turn to the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 15, we'll begin in verse 42 in a few minutes. In the mornings as I drive to work, I often listen to PBS. I get fascinated by the various guests they have on there and the things that they talk about. The other morning, they were talking to a man who was a military strategist. He's worked with General Petraeus and others, helping to figure out the strategy we would use in places like Afghanistan. They were not interviewing about that. They were interviewing him about something that he's now talking about, which has to do with the military strategy we will need within cities. Because of the fact that worldwide, we are having more and more people move to the cities, and the cities are getting larger and larger and larger. To the point that some of the large cities now, according to the predictions, the spaces in between them will fill in, and those will be cities as well, as more of the population moves that way. They give an interesting statistic. They say from the beginning of time until 1960, that's how long it took for the population, the human population of the planet, to reach 3 billion. That is from the beginning of time until 1960. It took that long to reach 3 billion. And the 50 years after that, we hit another 3 billion. And we're closing in on 7 billion. There are people who are already alive who may discover just how many people the planet can handle and what happens when it can handle no more in terms of having the resources to make all the things that need to be made, grow the food, have the water. One of my friends, Spencer Sutton, a great young man, I've known him since he was this tall. 5 years ago down in Birmingham, he founded a nonprofit organization that goes around the world just to dig wells to give people clean water. On his site, on the website I read, that in the world, some 22,000 children die every day as a result of not having clean water to drink. Water is being depleted. As a matter of fact, not just in other countries. If you pay attention, you've seen already the tip of that in the United States, where states in the last few years, particularly in areas that have been struck by droughts, have argued over who gets how much water from which river. I have a friend who farms on the high plains out in New Mexico. He says, Joe, I think we were kind of foolish to begin with, that we thought we would farm where nature didn't give us the resources to farm. We get little rain there, and we have been using the aquifers, and now the aquifers are nearing depletion. We don't know how many years it may take to fill the aquifers again. And if you get to some cities, you'll see the big signs. If you say in a hotel, please use as little water as possible because we are in drought situations. I've stayed in many hotels where that has been the case in the last few years. So water, food, all kinds of things. The world is not becoming a better place. The water, polluted many places. The air, polluted many places. And so, when everybody is born, as each person is born on this planet, nearly 7 billion of us now, we have many things that are so dissimilar. Maybe the color of our skin, or how tall we're going to be, or the kind of education that we receive, how much food we have. Some of those people are born into unbelievable luxury. You can flip on the television and flip channels and see the people who have things that we can only dream about having. I met a man the other day who does financial planning for people only if they can invest at least $20 million at a time. It just fascinates me that people have that kind of money to invest. I did not ask him to represent me. But most of the people who are born today are not being born into unbelievable luxury. Most of them are being born into abject poverty. And while China has been the nation that seems to have had the most people based on what we read and hear, India is closing in on them. And you say, what does all this mean? Well, according to this strategist, as they talk to him, it's going to be urban warfare. You understand what happened in Africa a couple of weeks ago in a mall. He says this kind of thing's going to happen more and more. At least that's what they're strategizing. And he's saying if somehow we don't figure out how to plan for all of this, it's going to be bad, really, really bad. Now, you might be thinking, we came to church to be encouraged, and so far you're failing. I am. But it's reality. It's what's actually existing in this world. So a student at Lipscomb University, one of Terry's students, takes his life, and we don't understand it. Our friend Deborah Leeper, her dear friend Barbara here, often brings her to church here with us. Last Friday night, Jan and Howard and Carolyn and John and Alice and I went with Barbara over to the memorial service of that young man who died a week ago today. 33, 34, 34. So young. So young. And to watch his mother stand there and be so strong, her only child. Death surrounds us, and we know about the deaths that affect the people that we love, and the dire physical conditions affecting people that we love and care about. And this church, as Dwight has pointed out on many occasions over the last 2 years, that John and I have been working with this church, almost 2 years, has pointed out that it seems that just family after family after family has been affected by sickness and death. But it's not just us. It's the world around us. So where's the hope? The Goads, you probably lived through the Great American Depression. Is that correct? You were? Okay. My parents did, and they're about, well, my father's gone, but my mother's about your age. When they call it the Great Depression, it's not because it was wonderful, you understand. That refers to the size of it. It was unbelievably big. My parents lived through it. They lived through it. When the stock market crashed to the point that some people lost everything they had and went about killing themselves, it affected the people in the cities, but it also affected the people out on the farms. And in that era, there were many more percentage-wise living outside the cities than there are living outside the cities now. People were losing their homes, losing their farms. Places like in Oklahoma and about the same region had what was called the Dust Bowl, where the drought was so bad that just everything fell apart. And back in that period, when there seemed to be no hope at all, a couple of guys came along writing gospel songs. You may have heard of the Stamps Baxter music. If you paid attention to the words of the music that came out of that era, first of all, the melodies they chose were upbeat and happy, kind of belying the words of the songs themselves often, because the songs were about things that were sad and painful. Then why would they put them to such happy tunes? You can imagine what it would be like in that era when people were coming to church. They probably weren't walking in the best of spirits, thinking how we're going to pay the bank, what we're going to do if the crop doesn't come in, what are we going to do if another factory closes. And so the music was made to be happy music, even when singing about unhappy things. And yet many of the songs were about happy things, and these folks began to concentrate on something very different, not different than what had happened in earlier eras when people faced catastrophes, but different than what had been happening here. Their music changed to thinking not about what's happening here, but about what would happen next. And when I say next, I don't mean next on this planet, but in the next life itself. And so the songs would come out, things like, "This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue," because they had no treasures here, you understand. But having read the Sermon on the Mount, they knew that Jesus talked about how we live would lay up treasures in the next life. And so they would concentrate. We don't have it here. This is terrible. But this is not all there is. We're going to have something beyond this in the next life. And so they concentrated on the resurrection. They concentrated not on the fact just that we will die, which, by the way, is at least one of the similarities for all 7 billion of us, whether born into luxury or poverty, whether to be educated or not. The one thing we all have in common is that each one of us will die. Not one is going to live forever in this body on this planet. But rather than dreading death, they begin to envision not the process of death itself, but what lay beyond. That on the other side, beyond life, there's got to be something. Because we understand that this something must exist. In the New Testament, in the passage I'm going to show you in a minute or two, he starts off this chapter, the Apostle Paul, by saying, if you have any sense at all, if you are a Christian, you would believe that there is a resurrection from the dead. The sacrifice, as Ron pointed out, is crucial. It's the key. It's everything. He goes on to say, and beyond that, the proof that it is valid is the fact that Jesus himself raised from the dead. And then he starts giving the evidence that people of his day would understand, that he appeared to many different people in many different places. Now let me give you the significance of that. A good lawyer would tell you today that eyewitness testimony sometimes is not the best testimony there is, because people see what they think they see or hear what they think they heard. And so when he says that Jesus appeared to these people and these people and these people, what he was saying it wasn't just one person or one small group at one time, which could be misinterpreted, but different people on different occasions in different places. And he had conversations with them, thus verifying that this man literally did come back from the dead. And if he did come back from the dead, then that gives us hope. As a matter of fact, the other way he would say it is, if we don't believe that, we are of most men most miserable. And so they sang about the next life. Let's give you an example of that. Terry, you and the group and the church, we're going to sing one of those old Stamp Baxter songs. Now, as you sing this song, think about it in the context of people who were living in the midst of misery, who were contemplating not just what there is to face here, but what would come next.
Can't sing this song sitting down. Let's stand as we sing together. I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. But in that city where the ransom will shine, I want a gold one, that silver line. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold. Don't think me poor or deserted or lonely, I'm not discouraged, I'm heaven bound. I'm just a pilgrim in search of a city. I want a mansion, a robe and a crown. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we'll never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold. Be seated.
Now, to live another life in this same body would not necessarily be a good thing. Anybody already wish you could trade this one in? So when he talks about the resurrection, as he goes through the 15th chapter, often referred to as the resurrection chapter in the New Testament, explaining all the things that would occur, he says, now this body is the seed. And he explains with this illustration, like if you take a little seed and put it in the ground, if you've never seen the plant that seed produces, it's very difficult for you to predict what that plant would look like just by looking at the seed. And he says that as his illustration of the body that we plant, this body, the one that goes back to the dust from whence it came, is the seed and can't really give us the vision of the body that we're going to have. So he starts explaining there are different kinds of things. For example, we look at the sun, it's different than when we look at the moon, which is different than when we look at the stars, but the stars themselves look different in the night sky. He said, so don't try to think that it's going to be what we understand now. This one's the seed. So beginning of verse 42, this is what he has to say. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. What he means by that is that we know what happens to bodies once they start to go back to the dust. It's not a process we like to watch. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. Let me stop and explain just about the first and second Adam for a second. Paul would often use that to illustrate things. The first Adam, the one that lived in the Garden of Eden, the one who was married to Eve, that one he will use to reference humanity, the natural side of us. And so he'll talk about Adam quite a bit as being, this is what a human being is like as a human being. The second Adam is that man that was also first to be what he was, which was a man that was born without typical human agency. He was not procreated. His mother was a virgin who was conceived when the Holy Spirit came upon her, and she delivered a child while she was a virgin, making him totally unlike anyone else. And so he was Adam. He was the first. He was different. And so the second Adam, Jesus, is showing us all kinds of things that are in contradiction to the first Adam, the one who lived in the garden. And so when he talks about the first Adam, he means our flesh, the way we are. The second Adam, he refers to Jesus and the way that he is. And the next verse it says, the spiritual did not come first. In other words, Jesus, but the natural, Adam. And after that, the spiritual, Jesus. The first man was of the dust of the earth. The second man from heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth. And as is the man from heaven, so also are those who are from heaven. And just as we have borne the likeness of the earthly man, so we shall bear the likeness of the man from heaven. What he means is that while human beings look different, in essence, we all look alike. Unless there is some kind of deformity that occurs, we typically have 2 arms and 2 legs and 10 fingers and toes and so forth. And so we've inherited that from our father, Adam. But he says this other body, this next one we're going to inherit from Jesus. Now, if you think about how the New Testament described that body, after he raised from the dead, he could eat. I like the idea of thinking that in the next body, I still get to eat. That actually makes me very happy. It really does. And I'm assuming that what in the Old Testament was called manna must have been what we today call Krispy Kreme. I'm looking forward to Krispy Kremes in heaven. Surely God will give us Krispy Kremes in heaven. So he could eat. He came back in that body and he would eat. But at the same time, it was a marvelous body because he could also walk through walls. You know, that song is about a mansion. Jesus didn't actually promise a mansion. If you look into the Koine Greek, of which I'm not an expert, but in John chapter 14, what he said is, I'm going to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms. Now, if you understand the culture of the day, that's how he would have explained it. Because if you've ever seen buildings from that era, the rooms that each person had, they were really very small rooms by our standards, very small. And so in a house, if the people lived there, they would just add more rooms, another room here and another room there. And they weren't magnificent rooms. They didn't have their own bathrooms. They didn't have all the things we have, just enough for a person to survive in. And that's what they understood. So he explains it with their illustration. In my Father's house are many rooms, meaning that this thing that God has can take care of all of you. I prefer to think that illustration is to that people of that time. I like the idea that the songwriter gave us, a mansion. I really don't care what it is, but it's someplace that we will have. This picture of heaven that some people have, that when we get to heaven, we're going to stand there and sing for all eternity, that just does not excite me at all. I mean, I love to sing on occasion. Other people typically don't like me to sing at all. But being in a place where you sing forever is not the Bible picture at all. It pictures that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And on this new earth, we get our new bodies. And those bodies are significantly different than these. This one is perishable. That one's imperishable. This one gets old. This one gets sick. This one has faults. But that one will have none of those. Not one. The church I was with this past Sunday down in Houston, the First Colony Church in Sugar Land, Texas, actually. They're in a newer building now than what I first spoke for them back, many, many years ago. In their first building, they had this magnificent foyer. After my last speech there, I actually had to run down that foyer to get in a car. A person was waiting to get me to the airport. Otherwise, I would not make it out on time. And as I was jogging down that big foyer while they were singing the final song, I heard somebody running behind me, which sped me up. I finally looked over my shoulder. It was a 15-year-old boy. He was gaining on me. I gave up. I knew I couldn't outrun him. I stopped. He ran up next to me. I had talked about heaven in my last speech, and he said, when I get to heaven, will I get a new one of these? And he reached down and pulled his leg off. I said, first of all, you don't need it. You can outrun me now. Secondly, no, sir, you will not get a new one of those. His face fell, and I said, let me explain. You won't need it. You're going to have a body that is perfect. There will be no need for anything artificial. not an artificial leg, not an artificial valve, not an artificial joint. None of those things. Our daughter Angel, as is true of several families in this church, is mentally handicapped. Her brain doesn't function like other people's do. It gives her a unique perspective on life now. I've told this story many times. Allow me to tell it again. I still love it. When she was about 6 or 7, she said, "Daddy, would you buy me a solid white horse?" I said, "Baby, if I did, what would you name it?" She said, "Spot." I said, "Let's think this through, babe. You wouldn't want to name a solid white horse Spot." She said, "No, I'll name him Brownie." She has her own logic, her own way of looking at the world. She's had heart surgery that was phenomenal. She just had some other surgery. It looks like she may be facing more. But when she gets the next body, the brain there will be fully developed. It's going to be a brain like I don't understand, because it's a brain that can actually, in a body, walk through a wall. I don't know how that will happen, but I think it's cool. I actually look forward to it. I hope it's not just that Jesus got to do that, because I'll try it and I'll break something. Actually, I can't break something, so I guess it's okay. I'll still try it. But he's talking about this new body in a new place. Well, he goes on. I'll read a little bit more. It just says we have borne the flesh. Let's go to the last verse again, gentlemen, if you don't mind. Okay, we'll just start there. "I declare to you, brothers, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God." What he's saying is, you might want to hang on to this body. I understand it. It's the only one I've ever had. You might want to hang on to this body, but it's not this body that will inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable, that's this, inherit the imperishable. Listen, I tell you a mystery. By the way, did you get this point in that last one? He's saying, as much as we hang on to this body, as much as we want this body to live forever, as much as we love this body, it cannot inherit the things that we want. There's actually a benefit that comes to us in dying when it comes to spiritual things. I'll tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. That's a euphemism that Paul would use to refer to death. We shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed. What he's talking about is that when Jesus comes, there will still be people alive on the earth. They will not die like everybody else, because they'll be here when he comes, but they'll change in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we, and in other words, anyone still alive, will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. If we believe that, we will still mourn. Even Jesus mourned the death of his friend Lazarus. I miss people. One of our dear friends, Alice and I, we went to college with him and his wife. A couple of weeks ago, he died. I miss him terribly. It's okay to mourn. But the hope that we have is that that is not the end. Now let me change gears for about 4 minutes, and I hope I'm not offensive with these 4 minutes. I grew up being taught so many things were required for a person to be able to get to heaven, that it was so easy that after you became a Christian that you could fall. That when I was a young minister and did funerals, I couldn't give much comfort to the families, because the theology to which I adhered made me wonder if anybody was good enough to get to heaven anyway. And so I would talk in those funeral services about death and about God and about heaven, but not much, if at all, about the person whose body was there. To the point that I remember one of our deacons came out after one funeral and said, "At least you could have said his name." That's when I realized what I was doing. I was so afraid, based on what I'd been taught, that unless you were just living a nearly perfect life, And the prayers that we prayed back then, the prayers would be like in a public assembly. Somebody would pray, and Lord, since we last stood justified in thy sight. Meaning, wow, we are hopping in and out of grace, and oh my goodness, I don't know if that person was in the right condition when he or she died or not. And so I'm asked often. My son just died. He's been pretty sporadic at church lately. Probably not living exactly like he should live. Do I have any hope? If we read these resurrection passages and find hope in them, and I certainly do, is it just applied to those people that we look at that have such exemplary lives that everybody can be assured that he or she is going to heaven? Or does God's grace also cover those in the periphery? You see, I can summarize it like this, and you can accept or reject because I don't have time to explain in detail. I'm quite convinced that there's one door into Jesus Christ, and that door is faith. Therefore, my understanding is there's one door out of Jesus Christ, and that door is faith. If you have faith in Jesus Christ, he makes you one of his. You are saved. He cannot expect us to be perfect and teach us about grace at the same time. Those would be inconsistent. You understand? Because people who live perfect lives have no need for grace. They have no need for mercy. And by the fact that Paul would emphasize repeatedly that God gives us mercy and God gives us grace, there is a direct implication. We can infer from that none of us then will live perfectly. Can you follow that logic? So how far? Again, I don't have time to explain it all, but my understanding is that the faith is still alive. The person is still in Christ. And all the promises of the resurrection and the new life and a new heaven and a new earth apply to that person as well. I don't know about you, but there are days in which my faith is strong. There are days in which my faith is very weak. If you were to try to find my faith pulse on those days, you could find it, but it'd take you a while. Because you'd say, man, the way you're thinking today, or the way you're talking today, or the way you're acting today doesn't look very faith-filled to me. I confess I have those days. Am I the only one here? And so sometimes they even ask me questions like this. My friend did himself in. Does that necessarily mean that he or she is lost? Look. Most of the world rejects Jesus. I have no authority to offer them hope, although I hope they have it. But those who do have faith in Jesus, whether that faith is super strong or barely there, are still in the grace of God. And so the hope of the resurrection, not a resurrection to hell, but a resurrection to life, I believe is still theirs. You said, then you think everybody's going to heaven. I just told you, most of the world rejects Jesus. But when a person has faith, no matter how strong or weak it may be, I have no hesitation whatsoever of looking at his mother or father or son or daughter or her friends or whomever and say, thank God for grace. And I'm quite sure that in the next life, when we run into some of our friends who died in ways that they really shouldn't have, the first thing we shall do is slap them and then hug them. How dare you hurt us like that? It's so good to see you. And from now on, no more lung cancer, no more diabetes, no more unbelievably bad falls, no more anything. Just health and happiness and a new body on a new earth forever. And there will be singing, but not every day. The Church of Christ will be over there without the piano, and everybody else will be over there with the band. And it will be heaven.
Open my heart to what you know, so I can stretch, so I can grow. My feelings torn